Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, this is the first conversation I've had in person with someone for the show since the pandemic. And I can think of nobody better. One of the most popular guests we've ever had on the show. One of, I think, the most interesting human beings I've ever met. One of my favorite people in the world. I'm a fan of, I'm blessed to be a friend of. The great and powerful Sebastian Junger is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you so much. I love talking about stuff with you, and I'm looking forward to it today.
We were saying before we got here, we just had lunch. I could talk to you about anything, and it would be interesting. We're talking about your flip phone that I want to get to. Yeah. I'll talk about your book, talk about parenthood, talk about the Veterans Town Hall, talk about all things going on in the world. But I want to start with the question I ask everybody, man. It's great to have you back. Usually I ask them, where are you and how are you? But we can ground it here. Where are you and how are you?
Well, we're in the Nexus Club in beautiful New York City. And thank you, Nexus, for hosting us. I live in the Lower East Side with my wife and two little girls who are age 6 and age 4.
And you've been back in the city for how long, man?
Well, my girls are in school, and they started off school a year and a half ago. So the fall before last, my eldest entered pre-K at the public school in the Lower East Side. And so we've been back here since then.
And the last time we talked virtually, I think, were you up northern New York, or were you in Cape Cod? You were somewhere else.
Yeah, we have a property in Massachusetts on Cape Cod, and it's an old house from about 1800. It's deep in the woods at the end of a dead-end dirt road, part of an organic farm, and there's a little community of folks there. And so we were hunkered down there during COVID, and it was a nice little micro community of people that knew each other and trusted each other. And yeah, it was an amazing place to spend COVID. As rough as COVID was, for us it was this interesting, like a really interesting time, because we got to experience this sort of intimate life in this small group. And that's not something that a lot of people get to experience, unfortunately.
Well, you and I have been emailing and staying in touch throughout the last couple of years, especially about going back and forth between New York and the country. What's it like to be back, to go from there to be back in the Lower East Side? What's that like for you?
Well, I feel like there's two different kinds of sort of wilderness, right? There's the physical wilderness of trees and hills and streams and what, we would have in Massachusetts. And that's something that I want to teach my daughters about. Like, I taught my daughter how to tell the difference between a human trail and a game trail. I was like, if you're on a game trail, you're going to have to duck under stuff because coyotes aren't that tall, and the trails that they have, like, they don't need 6 feet of clearance, right? And so I taught her how to follow game trails so they come to a human trail. So that's the wilderness. Then there's the human wilderness, right? So where we are in the Cape, it's not a human wilderness. It's an almost completely white population, good people, but very demographically very, very limited. Everyone knows each other. New York, it's a different matter. It's the greatest concentration of languages in the world. Every tribe, every race, every religion, every culture, everything is in this place. And we live in a mixed income neighborhood that is very demographically very, very mixed. And to me, it's like, oh my God, this is this other form of sort of wildness. Like, you don't know in human terms, like, when you go into the woods, you don't know what's going to happen in the woods. When you go into New York, you don't know what's going to happen with the people, like what kind of interactions you're going to have. And I learn things every day. I am entertained. I'm moved every day, like, in this city. It's extraordinary.
I love that. That's so well put, man. I never thought about it that way, but that is the excitement and the surprise and the diversity of the human wilderness in New York is that's a great way to put it. Like, it's such a shift from the wild wilderness that I was living on. I was on a mountainside where we had a bear roam through the backyard and feet of snow and all kinds of shit. But it was, teaching them about animals and about sunsets and about how to navigate and how to survive, how to build a fire, right? All the things that we did. And I'm so grateful for that time, but I'm also now grateful for this new perspective on the urban wilderness. And so we were talking about this at lunch, and I'm fascinated by you're like, I said this to you, I think, over lunch, like the next generation of Anthony Bourdain. I wish we could follow you around on your travels throughout the world and how you navigate the world. And one thing I was kind of giving you shit about, but I admire tremendously, you have a flip phone. Can you talk about you have a flip phone, how you have a flip phone, how you navigate New York City?
I never didn't have I never had a smartphone, right? And it was a deliberate choice. I mean, it was partly laziness, right? I mean, this is what I got. Like I stopped drinking a few years ago, and then I was thinking maybe I'll just go back to drinking. I was like, no, it's too much effort. I'm just going to keep not drinking because it's just easier than drinking. Like it just requires less thought, right? Yeah. And so likewise, like it's too much effort to get a smartphone, and I don't want one, right? Like the things it has to offer, I don't need, and they're actively distracting, right? The one thing I don't want is to be distracted from the experience I'm having in the world. And I'm sorry, like a smartphone that technology is a great tool. It can do a lot of amazing things, but the one thing it doesn't actually do is promote your sense of I am here now, surrounded by life. Like it sucks you out of the moment and out of the place. And I'm 61. I don't want to be sucked out of my moment, right? Like this is all I get. This is all any of us get. And I don't need Google Maps to navigate. I have a glove compartment full of maps, right? I know how to read a damn map. I got a compass. You know what I mean? I got a brain. I know how to hail a cab. I don't need to know the perfect restaurant within 3 blocks. You know what I mean? I'm obviously not on Tinder. I mean, whatever. Like you can go through the list. Like I can do without all that. What I can't do without is my peace of mind. And I watch the behaviors of people on smartphones. I'm like, you're not good, man. I mean, I watched these. I was walking my daughter somewhere, and there were these 2 cops standing on the corner. And it's not like it's a crime-riddled neighborhood, but whatever. The Lower East Side needs some monitoring, right?
Yeah,
and these 2 cops standing on the corner, like scrolling through their feed, right? And I take my girl somewhere. We come back half an hour later. They're still there scrolling through their feed. I'm like, are you kidding? What did you become cops for? Like, get rid of that thing.
Yep. So another thing I want to ask you about that we were talking about over lunch. And honestly, man, like I consider it a privilege to be your friend and to have a meal with you and spend time with you because of your wisdom and your insight, but also what I've seen through your life and through your work, which is a discipline. You have a personal discipline. I don't know how else to describe it, but we were talking about kids. And I was 40 when I had my first kid, 44 when I had my second, and I feel old. You were 55 when you had your first. Yeah. Yeah. But you're raising 2 little ones, 6 and 3, right?
6 and I just turned 4. Yeah, 6
and 4.
I mean, I'm sorry, 6 and 3. 6 and 3. Sorry. Yeah.
No,
right.
I got it. 6 and 3. Mine are 7 and almost 4. And we were talking about technology, and I've been really rigorous about keeping the boys off technology as much as possible. They don't have phones. They don't have iPads. We really try to regulate television, and when they watch television, it's usually sports, which has commercials, which is complicated. And I told you I either put it on mute and we do drills, or that we play a game called What Are They Trying to Sell You?
Yeah, right.
And then we go to old school PBS. Yesterday my kid was home sick, the little guy, and he watched Mr. Rogers, but like 1982 Mr. Rogers. Yeah. But I was telling you that I think it has to do with discipline, right? Like in order to keep your kids off technology and get them to appreciate books and nature and the world, you got to keep them off technology, but that requires more than anything else, parental discipline. So can you talk about just your approach to parenting and life with the kids?
Well, you're not going to keep your kids off technology if you are addicted to technology, right? Like it's not happening. You're not going to keep them off the TV, off the tablet, the phone, if you're glued to your phone, right? And my wife has a smartphone, and she actually, she handles it in a way that I don't think I would. I'm sort of obsessive, right? If I had a smartphone, I'd be on that damn thing, right? She's not that way. She's got a smartphone. It sits on a shelf. It's a tool, and she doesn't get sort of drawn into it. I don't, I mean, I smoke cigarettes once in a while, right? The reason I don't have cigarettes on me is I would smoke the pack, right?
Exactly.
So in order to smoke a cigarette once a month, I have to not have cigarettes on me, right? It's likewise with the phone, right? So you're not going to teach your children to remain unaddicted to technology. I mean, addiction is the big loss of freedom in this society, right? We have a fairly free and fair political system, fairly free and fair judicial system, et cetera, flawed, but it's oriented in the right direction, right? The way that we are not free, there's an internal loss of freedom that has to do with addiction, in my opinion, right? Drugs, alcohol, consumerism. People buy compulsively, then they're in debt. Then you're not free if you're in debt, right? And how, people die with an average of $100,000 in debt, something like that, right? Like 3/4 of America dies in debt. That's an addiction to consumerism, right? And the ultimate addiction, of course, is technological addiction, because it's always in your pocket. It's exceedingly compelling. It plays to all of our healthy human desires, which is to connect to other people. But the irony, it offers you the false promise of connection and destroys that connection, the real connection. The more it destroys the real connection, the more you need the substitute for it, and then you're screwed, right? And so if you sort of think about this in sort of economic terms, capitalism, which is an amazing tool for advancing the human race, like I'm all for capitalism, right? But you just think about it, like it has to monetize things. If capitalism doesn't monetize things, it doesn't make money, right? So how do you monetize human relationships? The only way to do it is to separate people and then sell them the solution to their distance, right? So if you want to monetize the mother-baby relationship, you're like, no, you don't want to breastfeed. Breastfeeding is bad for children. I mean, literally there was an era when doctors would say, don't breastfeed your child. It's bad for your child, right? Don't breastfeed, here's infant formula, right? How do you, like, what? No, don't sleep with your kids in the same room. You need a separate room with a video monitor and a crib, right? Don't carry your children, for God's sake. Here's a $2,000 stroller. Like, so you separate and then monetize the separation by selling back a solution to something that nature like never found to be a problem in the first place. And the final part of that is that you separate peers from each other. It's a very, very alienating society. You separate peers from each other, which makes people depressed and anxious. You sell them medication that fixes that, and then you sell them the substitute for human communication, which is smartphone technology, right? So Google, I think it is, if Google was a nation, its GNP would be, I think, number 16 in the world. Just to give you the scale of profit that this scam, and I think it's a scam, that this scam has allowed for. Like, it's in the trillions of dollars, right? So use that stuff as a tool, but it also comes with an enormous human cost in our society.
When I was coming up in the activist community, people would snap, like, as an amen. Like, to,
yeah, right.
When it's been, and I feel like every time I talk to you, you take me to church, and
and I'm an atheist.
Yeah, right. And the Church of Sebastian, the Church of Freedom, the Church of Awareness, whatever we call it. But that answer, that information you just shared, like, I'm gonna rewind that and play it, and I hope folks listening do it again, because it's very important and powerful and timely. And I want to build on that, Sebastian, because your book, Freedom, came out during the pandemic. I've given that book to more people than almost any other book I can remember. I used to give out Ready Player One a lot for random reasons, but it was Freedom is just a book that I felt was of the moment. And when we're talking about this word freedom and the loss of freedom, the gaining of freedom, you've become an expert on this topic, but you're probing all of us on this topic. And I guess I wanted to ask you, is America free anymore? Yeah. You know, in your view, in this moment, here we sit in the beginning of 2023, evaluate our, collective and individual rate of freedom, level of freedom, however you would approach that.
Okay, so in a society that's structurally unfree, like Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Iran today, many dictatorships around the world, North Korea, in societies like that, where there is no political or legal freedom, social freedom, there's always internal freedom, right? You have the freedom of the soul, the freedom of your mind, right? Until they kill you. But until then, you are in some way, your freedom, the only source of freedom is internal, right? If you're in a society that is structurally free, right? And we have the Bill of Rights and the amendments, we have the Constitution, we have a fairly free political system, legal system, again, flawed, deeply flawed in many important ways that we must work on. But theoretically, it is configured in a proper moral and free way, right? The application of that is a different matter, and we know that from George Floyd and everything else. Like, of course, we got to, but in concept, it's free. In a society like that, your loss of freedom is internal, right? So you can be in a free society. So my answer would be yes, America is a free country, except that an enormous number of people in this country are addicted to something, right? Go through the list, like drugs, smartphones, consumerism. They're addicted to debt, right? I mean, something like three. I mean, I'm going by memory here, and it may not be the right number, but something like 3/4 of Americans die in debt. I mean, it's a kind of economic servitude, right? You cannot make a living on minimum wage, right? You're working 3 jobs. If you're working 3 jobs to make sure that your kids have enough to eat, you're not a free person. And the classic liberal definition of freedom, going back 100 years, is economic freedom. Can the average person, hardworking person, pay for an average decent life? And if not, it's not a free society. Maybe legally it is, but economically it's not. The traditional conservative version of freedom is industry is good for society. A rising tide raises all boats. Is this a free country in the sense that industry is unfettered in its efforts to make money, right? That's the conservative definition. Somewhere in the middle, the country is going to have to integrate those two into some middle ground where both are legitimate points of view, right? I tend liberal, so I'm like a softie for the liberal argument, but I totally get the conservative argument. I totally get it, right? And we need that argument as well. I'll end with this. So while I was writing my book, I had the chance to interview someone who did a very bad thing when he was young. He grew up in a very rough part of Brooklyn and got sucked into the wrong business and killed somebody, right? He was a very smart kid, and he got into prison. He was looking at 25 years, and he got into prison, and he started educating himself. The education he'd never gotten as a teenager, right? He read everything. He found God. He found teachers. He found, whatever. And he worked and worked and worked on himself. And he got out of prison. And I was able to interview this man 2 weeks after he got out of a 25-year bid. They gave him, he got out in 22, something like that, on good behavior, right? So, and I asked, we were in a diner in Midtown. I met him on a snowy afternoon, and I said, listen, I had a great conversation with him, and I said, listen, I'm actually embarrassed to ask this, but I really am curious. Is it possible to be more free in prison than out of prison? Right? Now, I'm asking this of a black guy, a black man in America who just did 20 years, right? Who am I to even ask that? In my mind, I'm like, what? Right? And he laughed. He was like, of course it is. Are you kidding? He's like, he literally said, there's no smartphones in prison. It's hard to get drugs in prison. There's no no girlfriend troubles that, whatever, like all that messiness he said, in prison, you got nothing but time. There are no distractions. You got nothing but time. And eventually you'll have an honest conversation with yourself about who you really are and what you're doing there. And then you're a free man. He said a lot of people on the outside never even have that conversation with themselves. So to answer your question, sorry, I'm long-winded, but to answer your question, structurally, it's a free society and should be freer. I mean, there's some important losses of freedom, structural losses that I think have to be addressed. But it's in the spectrum of freedom in the world, it's an enormously free country, right? But the downside is that because we're a wealthy country, we are vulnerable to all kinds of personal addictions that really weaken our dignity, that weaken our personal power. And that's what that man was talking about. And if we can get ourselves to where he's at without having to do 20 years, if we can get ourselves to where he's at, now you're talking.
This is the format and the place to be long-winded.
Okay.
That's why I did this podcast, so we could have conversations like this without commercial interruption. And because these are the conversations that need to be had. And I'm lucky enough to know you and to have these kinds of conversations with you. And I wanted to do this podcast in part so I could share that because there's so much wisdom and insight packed into it and life packed into it. And so let me ask you, you're now in your 60s. You don't look it. You're in great shape.
Thank you.
You're boxing. You look like you kick everybody's ass. And do you feel more free? Do you feel more or less free than other points in your life?
Right.
Because you're in the latter quarter of your life, maybe, right? Or third?
Yeah.
Can you talk about your view on your own personal freedom? You're an incredibly successful writer. You know, you've got respect. You've got a beautiful family. You've got, looks like, your health. But how do you evaluate your own personal freedom?
So there's many different kinds of freedom, right? And so there's economic freedom, right? You know, a person can say, I'm making enough money to not worry about paying the bills. We can go to Cancun once in a while. I'm economically free. That's a very important form of freedom. Typically, you have to give up your temporal freedom in order to get economic freedom, right? You give up 40 hours a week working for the man or whatever, and then in return, you have economic freedom, right? When you're young, if at age 20, the only thing you want is economic freedom, okay, fine. You go straight into a job, you know, whatever. Like, you're in some ways you're too mature for in my opinion, there's a time in your life when you should be poor and unbounded, unrestrained in your choice. Like, I want to go to Brazil. What's Brazil all about, right? So, but if you're thinking like that at 60, and you're not providing for your family, that's not really freedom. It's just avoidance, right? So what I would say is in your 20s. So I've thought about this, like, when was I the most free? And what I came up with is, look, if you're young and single and live in New York like I was in my early 30s, that's a wonderful form of freedom. It's not a form I want now. I have a wonderful family. If I was doing that now, I'd be pathetic. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I was writing my book Freedom, and I asked myself, when have you been the most free? And so I sorted through all those ideas like I just did. And then I came up with this. I walked at one point with a couple of combat vets and another journalist who had been, like, holding my best friend's hand as he died from a shrapnel wound in Libya. And we walked along the railroad lines, which are these weird swaths of no man's land, right? These little strips of no man's land that crisscross America. The cops don't really go there. There's a lot of weird stuff going on there. You can do what you want. Like, we walked along the railroad lines from Washington, D.C. to Philly, and then wheeled west, and headed for Pittsburgh. So we walked through ghettos, we walked through factories, suburbs, farms, woods. We do everything. We forded rivers. We were sleeping under bridges, abandoned buildings, cooking over fires, getting our water out of creeks. Like, somebody shot at us in Pennsylvania, you know, whatever. An amazing trip, right? And so what I realized is that during this, I called it the last patrol. And I documented it in my book Freedom because I realized, thinking about all this, that for 400 miles or something like that, almost every night, we were the only people who knew where we were. No one in the world knew but us what stupid bridge we were curled up under, right? And like, that's it's not the only form of freedom, thank God, but it's a great one. So it really depends where you're at in your life and what your priorities are. And, you know, you don't want to mix and you don't want to get the match wrong. You don't want the youthful freedom at 60, you know. I mean, maybe you do, but you think about it hard.
If you're listening and you haven't been already convinced to get the book Freedom, that answer should convince you, because the book is amazing. And that whole last patrol is like the spine of it. And it's so fucking good. Let me ask you, we've been talking about world events. I want to talk a bit about American politics, about Ukraine, about some other things, but you have also now talked about this entirely unique experience you had where you almost died. I don't want to let you explain it, but I haven't talked to you for the show since that happened and since you started talking about it. And if you would, if you're willing, I would appreciate it if you would share how you describe what happened, you know, without, you know, all the detail that maybe you've shared other places, but explain what happened and what you've learned from coming out on the other side of that.
Yeah, so just some background, I was an athlete when I was young. I was a really good distance runner. I ran 2:21 marathon. Like, I ran some pretty good times. Not world class, but I was proud of it, right? And I went through my whole life, I sailed through my whole life as this, like, very healthy dude, right? And I'm never going to drop dead of a heart attack or whatever. I mean, eventually someone's going to take me, but it's not going to be me clutching my, clutching my chest and dropping to the floor. Probably not, right? So, and boom, one afternoon, a few years ago, I felt this sudden pain shoot through my abdomen. And I had sort of intermittent pain in my abdomen that I sort of ignored because I'm, like most athletes, I'm kind of a stoic, right? And if you're not screaming in agony, like, get back to work, right? And so, but this pain shot through my abdomen. And I was like, damn, what is that? Some crazy indigestion. What is that? And I stood up to walk it out, and I almost fell over. I couldn't stand up. My blood pressure was plummeting, and I had an undiagnosed aneurysm, a ballooning of the blood vessel in my pancreatic artery, which is this little artery that no one really needs to know about, right? And an aneurysm is sort of ballooning out of the artery, and they can rupture, just like in a bicycle tire, right? And it was pretty much asymptomatic, particularly if you ignore symptoms. It's asymptomatic, right? And it ruptured. It's very rare, and it's totally deadly. Like, the mortality rate is something like 70%, 70, right? And that's if you get to medical care quickly. I was in the woods in Truro in Massachusetts, right? And it took me, then, within 10 minutes, I couldn't walk. We were in the woods. My wife dragged me out of the woods, like literally dragged me out of the woods to the driveway where there's a little bit of a cell phone signal, and called 911. And the ambulance came, and, by then I was going blind. Because when your blood pressure drops, everything starts to fail, right? And it took 90 minutes. So I'm bleeding out into my abdomen. It's like I've been stabbed in the stomach, except there's no stab wound. It's all internal.
At that point, do you know what's happening?
No.
Can you
I had no idea.
comprehend what's going on?
No, I had no idea. And I rebooted a bit. I went into compensatory shock. Your body clamps down, pools all the blood where it's needed. And I sort of revived. I was like, oh, I'm okay. Maybe I don't need to go to the hospital, And my wife was like, no, you were in and out of consciousness 10 minutes ago. You were going blind. You're going to the hospital. This is why married men live longer. Literally.
Yeah.
Their wives are like, no, he's going to the hospital. Yeah. Don't listen to him.
You got a battle buddy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it took 90 minutes to get me to the ER. And right when we hit the ER, I went out of compensatory shock. My body couldn't keep itself together any longer. And I went into hemorrhagic shock, which is the last stage before you die, right? Convulsive shaking, loss of consciousness. I mean, I was swirling the drain, right? And I was, my blood pressure was 60/40, right? Which is fumes. You're running on. So I probably lost half my blood volume into my abdomen, out of my arterial system into my abdomen. And so they figured out pretty quickly what was going on, internal abdominal hemorrhage, deadly thing, right? The problem is if you have a stab wound, they know where to look. They know where to put their thumb, right? If it's internal, they have no idea. It's a big bowl of spaghetti in your abdomen, right? They don't know. I mean,
right.
So they have me on the thing, and they start cutting my neck open to put a line into my jugular, right? It's a little slice.
To pump blood in.
Right. So they can't get enough through your arm.
Right.
Typically, it in through your jugular, right? Because I needed a massive transfusion. I needed 10 units of blood, right? So while they're doing that, I'm headed out the door, right? I mean, I'm minutes from dead, but I'm conscious, right? And I'm lying there, and this big black pit opens up underneath me. And I just got to say right now, I'm an atheist. Not only am I a non-mystic, I'm actually an anti-mystic. Like, I actually actively hate that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like, just to get my credentials on the table, so you know where I'm coming from. This big black pit opens up underneath me, and I realize I'm getting pulled into it. And if I get pulled into it, I'm never coming out. I'm never coming back. And I didn't know I was dying. I mean, you have to understand how messed up your brain is when you're at 60/40. You're like the worst drunk in the bar. Like, you don't understand shit, right? But I knew that if I went in that hole, I'm not coming back. And I didn't want to go in that hole, right? And right then, my dead father appeared above me. Now, I'm still conversant. I'm still talking to the doctor. I'm not in La La Land, right? I mean, I'm still here, right? My dead father appeared above me with his arms open and welcoming me. He's like, it's okay. You can come with me. It's going to be okay, right? And
you heard him speak.
Well, he wasn't speaking. He communicated. I mean, and I don't know if I saw. The senses are very weird when you're in that state of mind. So his presence was there, and he communicated benevolent, like, it's okay. You can come with me. Don't fight it.
Right.
You're all right. Come with me. It's going to be okay. And I was like, come with you? You're dead. I'm not going with you. What are you talking about, right? And I said to the doctor, you got to hurry. You're losing me right now. I'm going. And they started transfusing me. And then that was the beginning of a 6-hour nightmare where they were looking for the bleed. And, I was conscious the whole time. They put a catheter in my groin and were like searching through my venous system looking for the leak. And I was on the fluoroscope, and I was on the fluoroscope for so long, I got radiation burns on my back. I got a big red square patch on my back, right? My kidneys are failing. So I was in agony. It's like kidney stone agony for 6 hours without any pain meds because my vitals were so low. And they finally found it, right? And they embolized it by catheter and then carted me up to the ICU. It's like 3 a.m. at this point. So this shit's been going on for almost 12 hours. I mean, I can't tell you how hard that was, right? And I started to realize, at some point in that process, oh, they're trying to save my life. Like, this isn't a tummy ache, right? This is the stakes, because I remember the nurse was like, Mr. Junger, try to keep your eyes open. I was like, why do you want me to keep my eyes open? And she said, so we know you're still with us. I was like, oh, fuck. Like, are those the stakes, right? Yeah. And anyway, they saved my life. And they took me up to the ICU, and I woke up the next morning, like very confused. And the nurse came in. She had an awesome Boston accent. This is Massachusetts. She was like, Mr. Junger, like, it's freaking unbelievable. You survived. Like, freaking miracle. Everyone thought you were going to die, but you didn't die. Like, the doctors can't believe it, right? That kind of thing. I was like, oh, my God. They talk in Boston accents in hell. Like, I guess I didn't make it. Like, here we are in the middle of Goodwill Hunting, right? Like, oh, my God. And she was this wonderful lady in her 60s who looked like tough as nails. She looked like she'd buried 3 husbands. Like, she was amazing, right? So she gave me the, like, lowdown on how I almost died. And then she left the room. And I was, like, sitting there. I'm vomiting blood. I'm completely messed up. And I'm too weak. I can't even sit up. I'm so weak, right? And I was just thinking, like, oh, my God, I almost died. My little girls almost lost their daddy. Like, my wife almost lost her. Like, are you kidding? And I had no idea, right? And she came back an hour later and said, how you doing? And I was like, not so good. Like, I'm thinking about what you told me. It's terrifying. And she said, you know what? Instead of thinking about it like something scary, think about it like something sacred. I was like, holy shit. What a thing to do with it. And so, of course, I started thinking about it. And I was like, okay, I went to the ultimate front line. I've been going to front lines my whole life. Yeah. There's things to learn there, right? It's the liminal place, like where, like, and I've gone to front lines and come back and told people what I learned, right? I'm like, this is the ultimate front line, and I was allowed to experience dying without having to die. I was allowed to go back with the treasure, with the information, right? What am I going back? What a value am I going back with? Right? What did I learn out there that could be helpful to me, to other people? Like, that's, as a writer, as a person, as a human being, as a thinker, like, that's now your job. You were allowed to have a sacred process. Like, don't waste it. And so what I'm doing now is writing a book called Pulse. Basically, what I learned on that threshold.
I don't want to talk. I want to let you keep talking. Yeah. And I think that we were talking about the next book, and I can't wait for this book. And I feel that way about every book that you write, but I can't wait for this book because, you have been to combat zones all over the world. You've been on the forefront of so many important conversations. And this one is, I think, the most important one, at least that I look forward to, especially because you've, had this perspective of being a father. Yeah. And can I ask you to share, first of all, thank you for sharing all of that, because that's a traumatic thing, and sharing it is hard, and it's a gift, and I'm grateful for it. And I know anyone listening is grateful for it, and I want to make sure I communicate that to you. But we were talking about our kids that are about the same age, and the crazy questions or the amazing questions they ask us. Today my son asked me, Daddy, how many people are going to be dead in 100 years?
Yeah.
And I said, I don't know, bud. And then he said, look it up.
Yeah.
Right. And I said,
Right.
okay, bud. And we shifted the conversation, talked about that, talked about some other things. But you talked about the conversation you had with your daughter about love.
Yeah.
Can you share that, please?
Yeah. I mean, the thing about children is they have no preconceptions about anything. So they see everything totally literally, and they see truths that we have learned to ignore. So I asked at the time she was 2.5. She just turned 3. She was 2.5. It was last summer, and I said to her, I was out like playing with her in the woods, and I said, Daddy loves you so much. Do you know that? And she just got all shy, you know. I was like, do you know what love means? She wouldn't answer. And I asked again. Like the third time, I said, you know, what do you think love means? And she said, yes, Daddy, I know what love means. It means stay here. Which is such an elemental definition of love, right? I mean, no adult, everything else is footnotes to that. Right. But the adults get absorbed in the footnotes, the complex footnotes, like, you know, I'm breaking up with you because I love you. Like, no, you're not. You're breaking up with me because you don't love me. You know, come on. Like, don't bullshit me. Right. Stay here. Like, stay here. And of course, that's super important to a child. Like, if you don't stay here, they're dead. They know that. Yeah. Everybody knows that. Right. So that's the core of love, is like, we need to stick together to survive. That's how humans do it. Right. Like, we are willing to die for each other. No other animal does this for each other, right? Chimpanzees, chimpanzees wage a form of warfare, and groups of male chimpanzees will go into a rival territory and one by one beat the individual males to death from the rival troop, right? Those males start screaming in terror when they're getting beaten to death. It's basically a gang fight. It's 6-on-1, right? They'll scream in terror. His buddies, what do you think they do? Do they go help him? No, they don't. They're like, oh, Joe's getting beaten to death. Maybe I'll go this way, right? And maybe I can even mate with his mate. You know, I mean, it's completely self-serving. Humans will die for each other because they love each other, right? And it's what allows humans to survive. We don't have claws. We don't have teeth. We can't run. We can't climb. What do we have? We have the fact that we will sacrifice for one another, and in a group, we are unstoppable, right? And it all goes down to stay here. Stay here. And so, I mean, on the flip side, not the flip side of it, but the perspectives are amazing. So my almost 6-year-old is sort of engaging with the idea of death. She saw her grandmother die. I mean, like, was with her grandmother. We were all with my mom for the last 2 weeks, right to the last moments, right? And at one point, she, makes children anxious. They know, like, they start to figure it out. And she said to me, Daddy, you know what my biggest problem is in life? I was like, no, you little 5-year-old, what is your biggest problem in life, right? What could it possibly be, right? And she said, my biggest problem in life is existence. I'm like, wow. Oh my God. I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, my biggest problem in life is existence because I exist, it means eventually I'm going to have to die. And I don't want to die. So that means my biggest problem is existence. I'm like, oh, you poor thing. You're overthinking things like I do. Like, you got the bad gene.
This is Sebastian's daughter.
That's right.
For sure.
You got the bad genetics.
No,
like, don't do that. Don't do that.
Genetics. The good genetics, man. I mean, I can't wait to one day read the books your girls write.
Yeah.
This also, a lot of what you just shared comes from Tribe, which is an amazing book that you wrote also, that I think was at an important time and was interwoven into a lot of the work that I've done in the veterans community. And you and I have been friends for a long time now. I don't know how long, over a decade, right?
Yep.
And our paths have crossed in many ways. And I want to get a bit about the veterans town halls that you're working on, which I think build on Tribe and build on this sharing that you're doing and at this moment in America. But I want to ask you about something right now. This country, right? I mean, you and I were talking about whether it's going to be Trump versus Biden and, what happens afterward. You don't talk about politics overtly in your book, and you probably don't talk about it that much, but can you analyze, given all of this rich context you have and going to the other side and back, how do you assess this country right now? Where are we? And maybe we try to dig into this a lot in this show. What do you think is coming? What do you think is next?
I think they're waiting for the Junger ticket.
It will definitely be an independent ticket because the parties ain't having us. And if you run right now, you're going to have a lot of supporters. Absolutely. Junger for governor?
Yeah, Junger for governor. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. I'm not an expert in this. I read the Times every day. I try to make sense of what I'm seeing. My dad was a refugee from 2 wars. His dad was Jewish. He was born in Dresden, Germany. The year of the Reichstag fire, they left because they knew what was coming. So his father was a journalist, right? So they went to he could live anywhere. So they went to Spain. And my dad was there till he was 13 when the fascists came in under Franco, and they fled. And they went to Paris. And then they were in Paris until the fascists came in, and they came to America. And he stayed in America because he said to me, fascism will never come to this country, right? And thank God he passed away in 2012. He didn't have to watch the shit show of January 6th. And one of the things that really offended me about January 6th, of the many things that offended me about January 6th, the sight of having a policeman beaten almost to death with the Blue Lives Matter flag on a pole. That no one in that crowd saw the irony and the grotesqueness of that is amazing. But one of the things that really offended me about that is that so many people have died for their own freedom and the freedom of others, right? It's one of the few things people will die for, that and their families, right? And their community, right? That freedom. And it was couched in terms of that disgraceful riot in our sacred capital was couched in terms of people defending their freedom, right? And people use the word freedom when they don't want to be morally scrutinized. As soon as you're I'm defending my freedom, so you're not allowed to ask any more questions because freedom's sacred. And so as soon as I say freedom, back off. I don't want to be interrogated about the details here. I just said the F word, right? So back off. That means I get to do what I want, right? But it actually doesn't. It actually incurs a higher standard, not a lower standard, right? And so I think in this country, I looked at the Spanish Civil War. I wrote a piece about it, and it will be in the paperback edition of Freedom, which comes out July 4. The way Franco came in was the conservatives. It was an alliance, sort of an unholy alliance of military, corporate interests, and the Catholic Church, right? And the liberals, a liberal coalition, won the election handily, they won the national election, and Franco said the fact that they won proves it was rigged, because a conservative Catholic country would never elect a government of Jews, communists, and homosexuals, right? It was almost literally the same language you sometimes hear today, right? The same sort of gallery of rogues or whatever. And so he said, therefore, because they won, it was rigged, and because it was rigged, we have to kill them because they stole our freedom, right? And that started a 3 or 4 year civil war that killed something like 500,000 Spaniards or something like that. I think 1% of the entire Spanish population was executed for their political beliefs. Not just killed in combat, was actually stood against a wall and shot, right? So that's exactly, what Franco did to take power in Spain was exactly what Trump was trying to do, only he did not have the support of the military. Franco had the veterans from a 20-year failed war in Morocco who were embittered. They were felt forgotten. They were the defenders of Spanish honor, and he weaponized those guys. He weaponized their anger, right? And in this country, there was a veteran component to January 6th, to sort of MAGA, to some of the Oath Keepers and all that, those guys. But at the end of the day, the military itself was not going to become Trump's personal security guard, right? And that's sort of what saved us. The institution that my fellow lefties think of as the least democratic part of America actually on January 6th was the most democratic, right? The U.S. military.
So what happens next? You know, be a weatherman here. Tell me what's coming. Is it a perfect storm? Is it what is coming? What do you see in this country that you understand and explore and feel so deeply when you see what looks like, you know, you and I were talking about, will Trump get the nomination?
Right.
You know, I think he likely will. And if he doesn't, he'll run independently. And I think DeSantis and Kristi Noem and Kari Lake and others will wait. And it comes down to whether or not Biden and Trump are alive when the election happens, if they're healthy, if they have some kind of health issue. But even bigger than that, do you think the country is going to get darker? Is it going to get more violent? Is it going to get better, or is it going to get worse? I hate to put it in those terms, but when you think about the America your daughters will grow up in, what do you predict, not just hope, but what do you predict it'll look like?
Well, I mean, first of all, the authoritarian regimes of Europe, both the communists and the fascists, I mean, they're both fascists, right? They're both the left and right-wing authoritarian regimes, post-World War II, I think every single one eventually collapsed. Like even Franco, I mean, he died in bed. But as soon as he died, Spain turned into a democracy. So you know, I think what I would say is that authoritarianism and the sort of radicalism that we're seeing in some parts of the left and a lot of the right, that radicalism actually, it's a great short-term strategy, but it actually doesn't work very well, right? And it doesn't work very well partly because it's anti-rational. I mean, at the end of the day, you're accountable to reality, right? You're accountable to the force of gravity and economics and everything else. And if you think that those things will just go away because you have a narrative, like, you're wrong. Eventually, you jump out a window and you don't believe in gravity, eventually you're going to hit the ground, right? I mean, and that's true politically as well. And so what we saw in the midterm is that kind of rabid nationalistic fantasy world that the right wing was engaged in about stop the steal and all that other nonsense, right? Like, it actually didn't work very well. It didn't get very many people elected, right? And which is enormously reassuring. And I'm glad, you know, woke culture is pretty damn obnoxious on the other side of the aisle, right? It's not storming capitals anytime soon, but it's pretty obnoxious. I don't think it works very well politically, you know? So, you know, I think what's going to happen is a sort of like curving back towards the middle, because I think the short-term successes of radicalism on both sides actually are not playing out very well in the long term. And I think there'll be a sort of Darwinian process where the non-extremist figures, with a few exceptions, but basically the non-extremist figures on both sides are going to be the ones that sort of win the Darwinian contest, political contest, and move into positions of power. And so, you know, what I'm more worried about is the culture. I mean, I think the political, legal world will sort of stabilize. January 6th, I think, was the danger point, and it didn't. It could have happened. Look, they could have killed Pelosi and Pence. I mean, they literally could have killed them easily, right? And then what? I mean, then you're really talking civil war. It's not. I don't think it's going to happen. And those guys are cowards anyway. Let's face it. I mean, the people that were in that building are cowards, right? And I don't think they were willing to die for an idea. I really don't. I think they were willing to pretend that they were willing to die, but they weren't willing to literally die. And you have to be willing to die to overthrow a government.
And for your freedom, right? And I want to build on that and ask you to talk about Ukraine, because you shared with me some of your early writing in a letter to the Ukrainian people, basically, as a preface to your forthcoming paperback. And your message on Ukraine, your thoughts on Ukraine are especially timely and profound in a time where, I guess maybe I'll ask it this way, Sebastian, is Ukraine more American than America right now?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think they look to us as a sort of template for how to have a free and fair country, right? And, you know, meanwhile, they have a huge corruption problem, as do we in different ways, right? I mean, the whole lobbyist industry is basically a form of corruption, right? But so my book Tribe is being used in Ukraine as a way of dealing with veterans after the war. So I mean, that was news to me. Someone told me that. It's been translated in Ukrainian. The Ukrainian publisher asked me to write a letter to the Ukrainian people, and in it I referenced what I found in my research in freedom, which is that humans are the only species where the smaller adversary can defeat a larger one. If you look at the early years of MMA, mixed martial arts, you had huge mismatches in size and weight, right? And the 120-pound guy sometimes could handle the 250-pound guy, no problem. That's not true with chimpanzees, right? It's not true with elk. It's not true with elephant. Only in humans, right, can the smaller individual beat the larger individual in a one-on-one fight, right? Likewise, smaller groups of humans can defeat larger groups, and they do it all the time. And if they couldn't, there'd be no freedom, right? If they couldn't, the largest fascist megastates would run the world. And in the 1600s, the Montenegrins defeated the Ottoman Empire. The Montenegrins were like practically Stone Age people in the 1600s. They defeated the Ottomans, right? The Taliban defeated America, right? Like they didn't have an air force. They didn't have artillery. Right. They barely had sneakers, right? And they defeated America, right? And they defeated in the sense that they fought longer than we were willing to fight, right? Which sometimes happens in a playground fight with a small kid versus the small kid just keeps getting up and like, so yep. That's so I wrote a letter to the Ukrainian people about the fact that history is with them, right? That the smaller group, as often as not, the smaller group wins. And my book Freedom explains the dynamics of that. It's divided into run, fight, and think. And those are the three ways of maintaining your freedom against a superior power. That's true of the labor movement, the Irish against the English, the Montenegrins. I go through history, like the Scythians against the Persians. So I was basically like, look, you're doing this for the world, because if Putin wins this, then all the other countries of Eastern Europe are actually like in danger. And if you stop Putin in Ukraine, you've basically saved everybody. And not only that, it will destroy Putin. I mean, as the one of the sort of brainier magazines pointed out, Foreign Affairs, I think, pointed out, there was a question: is Putin the greatest security threat to Russia right now? It's a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And was Trump the greatest security threat to America?
Oh, totally.
Exactly, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So can I ask, one part of your letter to the Ukrainians was about the three components that allow a smaller force to beat a larger one.
Yeah.
And I remember one of them was the role of women.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
So,
can you
I looked at the commonalities between like the commonalities between the labor movement in America, about 100 years ago, up against corporate interests, the government, and the National Guard, right? I looked at the Irish, all through the sweep of history. And so I was like, what are the common elements of successful underdog groups, right? So, and the Ukrainians have all of them, right? So first of all, you need leaders who are willing to die. Like die, D-I-E, die for the cause. And if you have leaders who are hiding behind the people that they lead, it's not going to work. So when the Irish were fighting the English in the Easter Rising, of 1916, was it? 1916? Their leader in Dublin took so many risks under gunfire that his aides were like constantly, got wounded twice in a week, right? His aides were constantly dragging him out of the line of fire. They were like, we need you. You got to stop doing this. Like, so you need leaders like that. Zelensky's clearly like that.
Yep.
Right? The CIA offered to evacuate him because, of course, what do you think would happen if the Russians caught Zelensky? How unpleasant would that be for him, right? Nope, I'm staying right here with my people, right? Yeah. So you need leaders who are willing to die. You need a transcendent cause, right? You can't we want to take over Crimea. That doesn't get people to die, right? What gets people to die is I'm fighting for my freedom and the freedom of my children, of my people. Like, that's a transcendent cause. So you need leaders who are willing to die. You need a transcendent cause. And in these complex struggles, I mean, I don't mean World War I machine gun fire. I mean, anyone can fire a machine gun. Mm-hmm. I mean, these complex struggles that happen within a society, like the labor movement, Ireland, the Easter Rising. You need women. Because women legitimize a movement. So if you just have a bunch of dudes in the street, it's a riot. Mm. If you have men and women in the street, women carrying babies, it's not a riot. It's a movement. And it's a movement that's very hard to use violence against. Right, killing women in large numbers is sanctioned. It's frowned upon in ways that killing men in large numbers just isn't quite. right? The optics are horrible, even for real dictators, right? Even the Saddam Husseins of the world hesitate to mow down hundreds of women in the town square, right? I mean, it happens. But so what I looked at the labor movement in Massachusetts, in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, and the textile mills were shut down by these strikes, and they called in the National Guard with fixed bayonets. And the men were in the front line of the strike, right? And they got their hats handed to them, right? I mean, you can imagine, right? And then the strike organizers had the idea of putting women on the front lines, right? And these boys in the National Guard didn't know what to do. They had sisters, they had mothers, they had children, whatever. And they didn't know what to do with the women. And one police captain said in frustration, he said this great line, he said, one good cop can handle 10 men, but it takes 10 cops to handle one woman. And when they did that, the dynamics changed. And they also used women for intelligence, for sort of covert missions. Women have men are hierarchical, which is very powerful. The top of the pyramid says, charge the machine guns. Everyone charges the machine guns. Half of them die. The other half take the trenches. That's a typical male hierarchy, right? Top down, right? Women don't operate that, thank God, right? I mean, you need both to win a fight, right? So women are lateral. Their relationships are lateral, and they actually don't like the idea of a hierarchy. They sort of rebel against hierarchies, which is enormously healthy also, right? So their networks, social networks, are lateral, which means you can't decapitate them. They're like terrorist organizations, right? Like you can't decapitate them. They're interrelated cells. They're very hard to penetrate, and they're great at espionage and all that other stuff. And they would, these women were like cozying up to some of the boys in the National Guard and in the police, pretending to be interested in a romantic involvement. And just stealing information, right? So the dudes can't do that. You need so you get those two together, the hierarchy plus the lateral network. You have a situation that governments have an extremely hard time dealing with.
Which is Iran right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. If it was just men being killed or tortured, tormented in Iran, the world would care a lot less. But when you see like young women, they're like, oh, no, that's not okay.
I told you this before we started recording. I wish you would come and talk just to America, like Sebastian's fireside chats once a week. I really do. And I know that you have a process for your books, and your books are such a gift to the world. But I think especially in moments like this, I just love hearing you talk, man. And I'm grateful for everything you share and this fucking amazing laser beam that is your mind, navigating through the world. For our Patreon members, I hope Sebastian will give a quick fire couple of questions after we get through this section. But as we wrap this up, because I want to let you go, you got to pick up your kids, you got to navigate New York City with your flip phone, you got to watch some MMA. Can I ask you? Well, number one, I want to say I hope you do think about some kind of public office or something like that. I know you're so amazing at your craft and what you do, and you live this life, but I feel like your voice is so important right now, and I just want to tell you that if you ever did run for anything or serve in office, you would have a tribe behind you. And I'm
only doing it with you, man.
Well,
you and me. I'll do it.
I'll be your campaign manager. How about that? How about that? I don't know. Well, you could run for governor of Massachusetts.
All right. Yeah.
All right. Okay. You're the first person to announce your candidacy here. I asked Ruben Gallego. I asked some other people, to announce on here, but you can formally announce Junger for governor. Junger for governor.
Junger for governor. Yeah,
he's coming to America. Having gone through all this, man, your life is this amazing journey. Having gone to that other place and seen the black hole and come back, what's your advice for folks? Is there one thing you would say to folks, or maybe to your daughters, if they're gonna, if they could listen to this, and maybe it's the older version of themselves, and they're living in this moment. What's your advice for folks out there? Because a lot of you're really great. I have to say this a bit. You're really great at communicating pain and struggle. And Ken Burns was on this show and talked about grievance. Yeah. And you and I have talked about, there's a lot of pain in this country right now. And there is just exhaustion and grievance and emotion and a lot of it. But there's also hope, and there's this unique spirit and camaraderie and community, and you're building on that. And the Veterans Town Hall, people should check out the work you're doing there on Veterans Town Hall, bringing that around the country. But what's your advice to people out there who are listening, who look to you as an inspiration, as a role model, as a bit of an oracle?
I think the only way to have a free society is for the people in it to value freedom. And the only way to be individually free is to not be addicted, in whatever that means to you, right? Whatever it means, but addiction is how society makes you work for them for free. That's what addiction is, right? And if you want to take that route, go for it, but you're not free. And so, addiction can take so many different forms. But when you're doing something that's more interesting to you than the world is, you're addicted, right? And that's how society gets its hooks in. And most of those hooks are economic, right? The addictions that are the most dangerous. Okay, I know people that drink too much, right? Whatever. That's not gonna ruin the country, right? But the whole economic system based on a sort of addictive consumerism that puts people in hock their entire lives while corporations are getting immensely wealthy and buying influence in the government so that then the government creates a system that furthers their interests and disempowers people. That could never happen if people were not the first chain in that addictive process. And you can, if they're going to screw you, at least be clear-minded about it. Like have a clear mind while they're doing it, right? And if you're addicted to anything, you are not clear-minded, and you won't even know they're doing it to you. And it starts with you. You don't need to storm any capitals, right? You need to take care of business at home, like the gentleman I spoke to about who had gotten out of prison. Like you need to have an honest conversation with yourself about who you really are, and then you're a free man.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've given us an injection of freedom. Really, man. And I'm not addicted to too many things, but all of us are going to be addicted to your words for now and for the future. But you're a tremendous leader and just such a gift to us. And I'm so glad you're not dead.
Thank you.
And that you're here with us and that you've joined me on this show. It's a real privilege. This is why I wanted to do this show, so that I could bring conversations like this to people. And I know they will draw strength from it and inspiration and freedom. So thank you, my friend, for this conversation and for all that you do.
It was a pleasure. I really enjoy it.
Thank you, man. Stay vigilant.